Cleopatra's story begins here, with a small band of men lost and dying in the vast empty wasteland of the western Egyptian desert. Led by the greatest military leader the world had ever known, Alexander the Great, they were trying to reach one of the ancient world's most remote shrines, the temple at Siwa Oasis. But the route to Siwa was unmarked, and Alexander lost his way. Two stories of what happened next now exist. In the first, a snake appeared and showed him the way. In the second, crows guided Alexander through the desert to safety. When he finally emerged from the desert, Siwa must have seemed like paradise, with cool, bubbling springs and date palms bending under the weight of the fruit. But Alexander came here for a specific purpose. Here lived the oracle, a priest famous throughout the ancient world for his ability to see the future. All ancient leaders consulted oracles before making crucial decisions, since their predictions were also tempered with political astuteness. Alexander had just conquered Egypt, but he did not want to rule as a Greek, a mere mortal. He wanted the oracle to proclaim him a god, so he could rule as a divine pharaoh. Egyptologist Dr. Bob Breyer is tracing Alexander's footsteps at Siwa.
When Alexander finally reached the temple, he would have entered this room alone. It would have been filled with incense. Over here is a Holy of Holies, where Alexander probably wasn't permitted to go. So if he left an offering, it would have been here. Perhaps a lamb, something like that. Then he was allowed to ask his question, am I a god? All the ancient sources agree that the oracle proclaimed Alexander a god.
With his divine stature confirmed, Alexander the Great marched out of this sleepy mud brick oasis and went on to conquer the largest empire the world had ever seen. It stretched from Europe to India. Three centuries later, shortly before the birth of Christ, Egypt was still ruled by a living goddess, Cleopatra. A Greek, she was also descended from one of Alexander's generals. She looked back to the golden age of Alexander's world empire and was determined that she would achieve more. Alexander died at the age of 32. By the time Cleopatra was 23, she had made her entrance into Rome as Queen of Egypt, the consort of Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the world. Cleopatra was born in the city that Alexander had founded, Alexandria in Egypt. It was a city of beautiful temples and palaces. It contained a lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, the greatest library the world had ever seen, and a renowned school of medicine. Alexandria was the greatest city in the world, and for 300 years it had been ruled by Cleopatra's family, the Greek kings of Egypt, known as the Ptolemies. Cleopatra's Alexandria was isolated from the rest of Egypt, cut off in the south by the marshes and in the north by the Mediterranean Sea. It was an oasis of Greek culture. But today, that world has completely vanished. The sphinxes and obelisks that once decorated the palaces have collapsed into the waters of the city's harbor. The famous lighthouse is now only seen by the fish that swim among its ruins. But a few places remain, deep under the streets of modern Alexandria, that provide a glimpse of Cleopatra's lost world. The steps that Bob Breyer is descending lead to an ancient burial place, one that was discovered only at the beginning of this century.
This shaft is large enough so the bodies could be lowered to the burial chambers beneath.
Many mummies pass through this shaft.
This is where the wealthy Alexandrians were buried. They were still hoping for immortality, so they were mummified. But by this time, the embalmers had lost the skill of how to remove the brain through the nose without damaging the face. They were cheating and skimping on the oils and the frankincense and myrrh needed for mummification. But they covered it all up with elaborate wrappings. By the time the mummy was put in here, who would know?
But the ancient Egyptians still decorated the walls with their gods in the hope of gaining immortality.
This was Cleopatra's world. It was a weird world. It was a mixture of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman civilization. Cleopatra was a Greek with 300 years of Greek ancestry, but she was queen of Egypt, a land that had scarcely changed at the time of the pyramids. But Rome was the dominant military power in the area. Look at this guy. He's got the body of a Roman centurion and the head of an Egyptian god. These were complex times. To keep your throne, you had to be adaptable, ruthless, intelligent, and a great politician.
Cleopatra possessed all these traits. This could be the reason why history has provided us with many interpretations of the Queen. Renaissance poets saw her as a heroine, dying for love in their erotic portrayals of a bare-breasted queen. The image of Cleopatra as a temptress was reinforced by Hollywood, starting with Theda Bara's seductive portrayal in 1917. But who was the real Cleopatra? And what did she really look like? Bob Breyer hopes to find out.
We're in Berlin because this is the best portrait of Cleopatra in the world. There are very few ancient sculptures that are existing. So this is probably as close as we're ever going to get to how she really looked. She's rather plain looking, isn't she? Look at her hair. It's tied up in a simple bun. It's a classical Greek hairstyle. It's practical, but not exactly designed to captivate a Roman general. We know from ancient sources that her hair was a reddish color, wavy. But look at her nose. It's a little bit too long and hooked at the end. And her mouth, it's not exactly sensual. She's not wearing any jewelry. There are no earrings, no necklace. This is not the portrait of a femme fatale. The ancient sources tell us she was intelligent, witty, charming, a linguist. And along with this, she had a tremendous determination. It was this amazing combination of abilities that made Cleopatra the most famous woman in history. It wasn't her beauty.
The search for the real Cleopatra begins 800 kilometers south of Alexandria on the island of Philae. This is where Cleopatra's ancestors, 12 kings named Ptolemy, built the beautiful temple to the goddess Isis. For 3 centuries, they continue to add more. Here on the temple walls, the hieroglyphs tell the history of Cleopatra's extraordinary family. This is the first building on the island, the Temple of Isis. Depicted on the entrance gate is Ptolemy II. He was called Philadelphus, sister lover, because he married his sister Arsinoe. Isis and her son Horus are depicted with him. The temple to Isis was completed by Ptolemy III, the last great Ptolemy. He conquered Babylonia and Persia and returned with treasures that had been taken from Egypt. But from then on, the Ptolemy dynasty deteriorated. This temple to the goddess Arsinoe was built by Ptolemy IV. He murdered his uncle, brother, and mother, and his descendants were just as ruthless. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was nicknamed the Bastard. Later, he was renamed Auletes, the flute player, because he spent his entire time playing, avoiding his responsibilities as ruler of Egypt. So how, with such a family background, did Cleopatra become the most famous woman in history? There is practically nothing left of Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. In Cleopatra's time, it was reputed to be a beautiful city. As a young girl, she came here with her father, the pharaoh, on a state visit. Here, she undoubtedly saw the sacred Apis bull, a bull said to be born when lightning descended from the heavens and impregnated a cow. It was noted for its special markings, wings on its back, a beetle on its tongue. Perfumed and pampered, it was kept in a temple, and at festival time, or when a pharaoh and his family visited, the Apis bull was led in a procession for all to see. Bob Breyer has come to Memphis to see the ruins.
One aspect of the Apis bull that Cleopatra wasn't shown is this table on which the Apis bull was mummified. It was a secret process. The art of mummification was passed down from father to son within families of embalmers. There were millions of people mummified, but there's not a single papyrus that gives the details. The only exception is the Apis bull. You see, there was only one Apis alive at any one time, and he could live for 30 years. So if when he died, the embalmer that mummified the previous bull was dead, nobody would know how to do it. So they had to write down the details. The bull was placed here, and it was injected with chemicals to dissolve the internal organs so they would run out before they could decay inside the body. The table slopes so the body fluids would come down here, through this hole, into a spout, and be collected in the basin at the end. What's neat about the table is that it was designed for a specific purpose, mummification. But it's also a beautiful piece of alabaster, carved like a work of art, with lions on either side. It's details like that that makes Egyptian art incredible.
Across the Nile was the Serapeum, the underground burial place of the Apis bulls. For centuries, the mummified bulls had been brought here in solemn procession by shaven-headed priests to be buried in rooms carved beneath the desert sands. Cleopatra would have heard the priests chanting prayers in Egyptian, a language she couldn't understand. The experience must have been overwhelming, and it may have been here, in the Serapeum, that Cleopatra made a decision to learn the language of Egypt and immerse herself in its ancient religion. Cleopatra was 18 years old when her father died. His will stipulated that Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy would rule jointly, but they hated each other. Inevitably, arguments took place between them. The feud did not go unnoticed. Rome needed Egypt's grain to feed its growing population, and Julius Caesar, the great Roman general, needed Egypt's wealth to finance his army. Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome and the richest country in the world. To settle the dispute, Caesar took up residence in the palace in Alexandria and summoned Cleopatra and Ptolemy. Afraid her brother would attempt to kill her, Cleopatra had to find a secret way of reaching Caesar. Legend has it that Cleopatra seduced Caesar, but she was a very young woman, and Caesar had a reputation as a notorious womanizer.
Hail, Cleopatra, mistress of the two lands, daughter of brave, kindred...
But there is no doubt that there was a strong physical attraction between them. Caesar was captivated by the young queen. Women in Egypt had always been powerful. Queen Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, and now Cleopatra. But during the era of the Ptolemies, even the role of the common Greek woman had changed dramatically. They gained their own identity, apart from their husbands or families. Women participated in the arts and in civic life, and marriage became a union of two people, not just two houses. Cleopatra was well educated and had strong ideas of her own. During fighting between the Egyptians and Caesar's Roman troops, one of the greatest tragedies of the ancient world occurred, the burning of the Library of Alexandria. As an intellectual, Cleopatra would have been heartbroken by this. Though the library has now completely disappeared, Bob Breyer has come here, under the monument called Pompey's Pillar, to find a clue as to how it must have looked. This is just the annex of the library. It held a few thousand scrolls. The Great Library may have contained as many as 500,000.
The catalog alone ran to 120 volumes. But these weren't volumes in the modern sense of a book. They were scrolls made out of the papyrus plant, which was cut in strips which were glued together naturally with their own sap. They were rolled up and placed in niches like this one. It's sad to think about what was lost in the fire at Alexandria. There are the missing manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato. They were probably there. There was an entire room with editions of Homer. Maybe even there were early manuscripts of the Old Testament, which could probably help settle biblical questions today. Cleopatra was eventually able to replace 200,000 of the manuscripts. Books were very important to her. It's ironic that today, everybody knows her for her beauty, but it was her intelligence that was the most important asset she had.
Enjoying both the company of Cleopatra and the comforts of the Alexandrian palace, Caesar delayed his return to Rome. She decided to take him on a tour of Egypt. There is no doubt that a strong love was growing between them, but Cleopatra may have had a political reason for the cruise. She would impress Caesar with Egypt's greatness. In Egypt, she was a goddess, and when Caesar sailed into their towns escorted by Cleopatra, the Egyptians would perceive him as a god also. Their first stop was Giza, where Caesar would have seen the pyramids and the Sphinx. Even to this noble couple, these monuments were already 2,500 years old. These are the only remains of a temple built by Cleopatra in Egypt. Rarely visited today, its ruins sit in the middle of the modern village of Armont. Although at first glance they do not appear to be significant, they were, in fact, a turning point in the history of the world. Here, 2,000 years ago in this sleepy village, the Roman Republic died. Bob Breyer explains.
You see, Caesar was an elected official. Rome was a democracy. But as he traveled with Cleopatra, he was viewed as her husband, as a god. So by the time they got here, he believed it. Now, she was about 5 months pregnant by this point, and they made a plan that if the baby were a boy, they would build a temple on this site to commemorate its divine birth. Caesar's son would be a god. Now, at this point, Caesar was finding it very hard to view himself as responsible to a bunch of Roman politicians. And this idea that Rome was presided over by a god somehow took hold. Caesar was succeeded by Roman emperors who viewed themselves as gods. It's weird, but on this site, Roman democracy died.
The ancient Rome we know today, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, is Cleopatra's legacy. She showed a fledgling Rome how a god should live. After her death, every Roman emperor aspired to the grandeur and opulence of Cleopatra's Egypt. When Cleopatra gave birth, she gave her son a Roman name, Caesarion, Little Caesar, after his father. Caesarion would become the focus of Cleopatra's ambitions for the rest of her life. When she joined Caesar in Rome, it was not only to be with the love of her life, but also to further her plans for Caesarion. She believed that one day he would rule an empire as vast as Alexander's. Caesar provided a villa with beautiful gardens for Cleopatra to live in. This shows just how important she was to him. For a man who was now in effect the dictator of the Roman world, and whose adversaries suspected him of aiming at kingship, this was a dangerous step. But for Caesar, it was worth the risk. When Roman generals returned home, they celebrated their triumphs and commemorated their victories in the form of elaborate parades. The entire city would turn out to see the spectacle. When Caesar celebrated a triumph here in Rome, he led the procession. Behind him, there would have been carts piled up with the treasures that he had plundered in war. This was more wealth than the Romans had ever seen, but Caesar made sure that they shared in the bounty. He gave them extra measures of grain and olive oil. They pushed forward to see the spectacle in these crowded streets, knowing a banquet lay ahead of them, paid for by Caesar. Sometimes the drinking began before the banquet, and in the pushing and shoving, many people were trampled to death.
Cleopatra was in Rome when Caesar celebrated the Egyptian triumph. This was for his victories over her enemies. Now at this one, there was something special. Behind Caesar's chariot was Cleopatra's hated sister, Arsinoe, in golden chains. Now, Cleopatra must have had mixed emotions about this. He was her enemy, her sister, defeated by Caesar, her lover. But on the other hand, her sister was an Egyptian, a Ptolemy, defeated by Rome. And Cleopatra loved Caesar, not the Roman state. The sight of her sister in chains in a Roman triumph was something she would remember for the rest of her life.
But for now, Cleopatra was triumphant. She was the talk of Rome and the mother of Caesar's only male child. Caesar's victories had made him powerful and wealthy. He spent a large part of his fortune buying land in the central area of Rome and constructing shops, houses, and a temple. In this temple, he placed a statue of Cleopatra, an act that could leave no one in Rome unaware of his feelings towards her. And by a freak accident, Cleopatra's influence on the Romans has been perfectly preserved right up to the present day. There is only one painting left of an obscure hill in southern Italy before it blew up in AD 79. In one of the greatest volcanic explosions in history, Mount Vesuvius deposited millions of tons of ash and poisonous gas on the beautiful Italian town of Pompeii, killing most of its inhabitants, but preserving the town forever. One of the most important temples in ancient Pompeii was dedicated to the Egyptian goddess Isis. When Vesuvius erupted, the Isis temple was buried and became frozen in time. The temple walls show just how fashionable it was to be Egyptian. On them, ibises, cobras, and crocodiles were painted. There was even a pool filled with sacred Nile water. Cleopatra dressed herself as Isis for religious ceremonies. A young Roman initiate, intoxicated with the mysteries of Isis, described what she might have looked like.
Isis' long, thick hair fell in tapering ringlets on her lovely neck and was crowned with an intricate chaplet in which was woven every kind of flower.
After nearly 2 years in Rome, Cleopatra must have believed her goal was in sight. She was the most powerful woman in the world, allied with the most powerful man. It seemed certain that their son Caesarion would indeed inherit an empire as great as Alexander's. But the Roman Senate was afraid that Caesar, influenced by Queen Cleopatra, had come to view himself as a god and wanted to rule as a king. They would not allow any move that would threaten their democratic republic. Caesar must be stopped at all costs. His love for Cleopatra and his divine aspirations had led him to a violent death. Caesar's murder pushed Rome to the brink of civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend and general, and Cleopatra's strongest ally in Rome, appeared before the Senate. He told them that Caesar had acknowledged Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, as his heir, that Caesar's nephew Octavian claimed that he was the rightful heir. There was little time for Cleopatra to mourn Caesar's death. With civil war about to break out, she returned with Caesarion to Egypt. During Cleopatra's absence, Egypt's economy had declined. Government spending was out of control, inflation was rampant, and the administration of the country was in the hands of corrupt Greeks. The system they had created resembled slavery. The Egyptians worked the fields and were taxed remorselessly so that the Greeks could live in luxury. Although Cleopatra did not change the system completely, she did reform it, making it more efficient and reducing corruption. This improved the lives of both Greeks and Egyptians. She channeled all her youthful energy in returning Egypt to its former greatness. Her ancestors, the Ptolemies, had made fortunes from the frankincense and myrrh they had brought from Arabia, and from the pepper and exotic goods they took from India. But the key to this successful trade was the caravan route from the Nile to the Red Sea. Cleopatra kept the 175-kilometer road open by posting sentries. They would watch the road ahead from high hill posts across the desert. Each watchtower was within sight of the next, so by using mirrors in the day and fires at night, the entire route could be quickly alerted if bandits were spotted. Inns were provided where the caravans could rest after the day's journey. There were small rooms for the men, built around a central courtyard where the animals were tethered. Each caravan stop had a well, so the animals could be watered and water skins refilled. Cleopatra kept the caravan route open not only for the taxes it provided, it was the source of many of the luxuries with which she adorned her palace in Alexandria. One of its extravagances was porphyry, the purple stone that Roman emperors would later use for their statues, imperial porphyry. The only porphyry quarry in the world was in Egypt, near the Red Sea, and Cleopatra was the first to exploit it. At the foot of the hills from which the porphyry came, a small mining town developed. The porphyry was found high in the mountain, known as Gebel Dukhan, or Smoking Mountain, named because of the clouds of dust thrown up by the quarrying. The blocks taken out of the mountain were hauled down ramps to the valley below. When first quarried, the stone looks insignificant, but when carved and polished, its luster is spectacular. It took superb administrative skills to open and work the porphyry mines, and Cleopatra was more than equal to the task. After Cleopatra recovered from the loss of Caesar, she fell in love for the second time. Rallying the forces still faithful to Caesar's memory, Mark Antony had embarked on a military campaign that had made him the master of the Eastern Roman Empire. But to defeat his enemy Octavian, he needed the treasury of Egypt. So he summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus on the Turkish coast. Cleopatra did not respond immediately, but in her own time and in her own inimitable style, she sailed into Tarsus. It was clear that Cleopatra and Antony could benefit from each other. She needed him if her son Caesarion was ever to rule a vast empire, and Antony needed Egypt's wealth to finance his campaigns. But here too there was a strong physical attraction. By the time they returned to Alexandria, they were lovers. Eventually, Antony had to leave Cleopatra to go to war. She was soon to be the mother of twins. But not long after Antony's departure, Cleopatra learned that he had married another woman. For the second time in her young life, her dream of Caesarion ruling an empire as vast as Alexander the Great's was smashed. She was now 29 years old, the mother of 3 young children, and alone. In times of distress, people often turn to religion, and Cleopatra did just that. It is at the great temple of Dendera in southern Egypt where more can be learnt of Cleopatra's beliefs. In basic terms, religion in ancient Egypt was a transaction between the gods and the pharaoh. If the gods received the proper offerings, they would keep Egypt safe and prosperous. Cleopatra's responsibility was to ensure that the transaction went smoothly, and the temple was where this exchange took place. When Cleopatra visited Dendera, she would have entered the Holy of Holies, where only she and the high priests were permitted. The morning ceremony began by removing the clay seal from the shrine. throwing open the doors and revealing the statue of the goddess. Offerings of food, flowers, and scented oils were made. Prayers were recited, hymns chanted, and incense was offered. All would follow in its proper sequence before the day's activities could begin. The majority of the time, shaven-headed priests would stand in for Cleopatra. But in the most important ceremonies, Cleopatra would have attended herself, like the one that would have taken place here on New Year's Day, to ensure that the Nile would rise and the crops would flourish. At dawn, the priests would remove each divine statue from its shrine and in a sacred procession carry the gods to the roof of the temple for the ceremony of the touching of the disc, when the statues would be exposed to the first rays of the sun. If these rituals were performed correctly, then for the rest of the year, Egypt would prosper. The only remaining scene from antiquity that shows Cleopatra making offerings to the gods is here on the back wall of Dendera. Normally, the queen would be accompanied by her husband, the pharaoh, but Cleopatra was no ordinary queen. Her beloved son, Caesarion, is shown as pharaoh. Cleopatra had even greater aspirations for him than just to rule Egypt. Caesarion, she hoped, would rule the world. Suddenly, after having deserted Cleopatra for 3 years, Mark Antony re-entered her life. To realize his plan to seize control of the entire Roman Empire, he needed Cleopatra and the wealth of Egypt. He asked for a rendezvous. Why would Cleopatra agree? Bob Breyer explains.
Cleopatra was more than a legend. She was also a human being. She was returning to a man who had been her lover, had fathered 2 of her 3 children, and had agreed to champion Caesarion as Caesar's heir. But he had also abandoned her, married another woman, Octavia, so she must have had mixed feelings. She could probably justify the marriage as a political one of convenience. But I think the abandonment was really hard to justify. So when she went to Antony, it was with mixed feelings, but very specific goals. She was going to negotiate the futures of her children. If Cleopatra was going to put the vast wealth of Egypt at Antony's disposal, he was going to have to meet some very specific demands.
Antony agreed to give Cleopatra the whole of Arabia, the copper mines of Cyprus, the rich turquoise of Sinai, all of Armenia, the lush grain fields of North Africa, and the crucial ports of Phoenicia. It was a very tempting prenuptial agreement. But Rome was furious. An Egyptian queen had been given territories that Romans had fought and died for. Octavian used this outrage to rouse his troops for a final conflict in the civil war with Antony. The Battle of Actium, fought off the coast of Greece, would determine the future of the Western world. When Antony sailed into battle at Actium against his rival Octavian, Cleopatra went with him. As well as her flagship, she brought 60 Egyptian vessels. It was unheard of for a queen to be at the heart of a battle, but Cleopatra wanted to stay close to Antony to ensure victory. As the battle continued, victory, it seemed, would be Octavian's. Late in the afternoon, a strong wind blowing in the direction of Egypt gave Cleopatra the opportunity to free herself from the fray. She raised sail and set off towards Egypt.
She's going! Cleopatra's going!
But Antony, in the thick of battle, on seeing Cleopatra's departing ships, abandoned the fight. To the astonishment of his men, he sailed after her. He was no longer their brave Roman commander. He was a follower of Cleopatra. Defeated in battle, Antony sulked on the deck of Cleopatra's ship during the voyage. When they reached Egypt, he disembarked at a remote site. Here on the barren coast, Antony broke down. Accompanied only by a single servant, he would do nothing, would see no one, and plunged further into despair. But Cleopatra continued on for Alexandria to plan her next move. As Antony sunk deeper into depression, Cleopatra went into action. Following the route of the modern Suez Canal, she had her remaining ships hauled from Alexandria, 160 kilometers overland to the Red Sea. She planned to sail with her children to the safety of India, and with her treasure, found a new empire. It was her last chance, but it could work. As the ships were being prepared, disaster struck. From their hidden stronghold, the inhabitants of ancient Petra in Jordan, who had long been under Cleopatra's domination, saw that she was weak and seized their chance. They attacked and burned the entire fleet. For Cleopatra, there would be no escape. As Octavian's troops neared Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra knew that only humiliation and death lay ahead. Cleopatra had already prepared her tomb, now lost under the waters of the Mediterranean. At the beginning of this century, a tomb of solid alabaster was discovered in Alexandria. It was in a tomb similar to this, but far larger and grander, that Cleopatra would have prepared for her death. Ever the true Roman, Antony fell on his sword and was taken in his death throes to Cleopatra to die in her arms. Cleopatra then prepared for her own death by a method appropriate to the last of the pharaohs. For 2,000 years, Cleopatra's death has been shrouded in myth. Though all agree that she died by snakebite, there are endless arguments on the specific details. In Egypt, there are only two poisonous snakes, the cobra and the horned viper. The bite of a horned viper is only 20% fatal and causes grotesque swelling, so it's unlikely that Cleopatra would have chosen this snake. The cobra's venom is far more lethal, and its bite is often difficult to detect. Moreover, death by cobra bite was a well-documented means of execution in Alexandria. Galen, the famous physician, witnessed the execution of prisoners who were sentenced to death by having cobras placed on their chests. He commented that it was a mercifully rapid death. So it was the cobra that saved Cleopatra from being chained and exhibited as a Roman triumph. Octavian feared that Cleopatra might commit suicide, so he made sure that everything that was sent to her was closely inspected. But Cleopatra was not to be defeated by Octavian. Upon opening the doors, Octavian's soldiers found Cleopatra lying dead upon a bed of gold, dressed in her royal ornaments. One handmaiden lay dead at her feet. Charmian was adjusting her queen's crown. When Octavian finally celebrated his triumph in Rome, all that he could display was a painting showing Cleopatra being bitten by a snake. The cobra, symbol of royalty that had protected the kings and queens of Egypt for 3,000 years, had struck one last time, saving Cleopatra from humiliation. Cleopatra's beloved son, Caesarion, was murdered by Octavian. Her younger children, sent to be raised in Rome, eventually disappear from history. Egypt, now a mere Roman province, had seen its last pharaoh. With Cleopatra died the greatest civilization the world had ever known. Alexandria ceased to be a center of learning. Its library and beautiful palace slipped beneath the sea. The great temples of Egypt were deserted and became covered by sand. The ancient rituals of the priests were silenced forever, their language extinct. But Cleopatra, the woman who had gambled for the highest stakes and lost, was never forgotten. When the names of the great pharaohs of Egypt were no longer remembered, one name endured throughout the centuries: Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt.
Uncovering new insights into the construction and meaning of the Great Sphinx and the enigma of the pyramids. Discovery Signature, The Great Egyptians, tomorrow night at 10.